Hello, everyone. I hope you're all happy and healthy along with your respected families wherever you're located on this God's green earth. Welcome on Real Talks with Amini. And on this episode, we are honored to have Lauryn Oates, Executive Director to the organization, charity organization, Right to Learn Afghanistan, which was previously known as Canadian Women for Afghanistan's Women. And we'll discuss with her about the current situation in Afghanistan and also what are the pathways for Afghanistan's future. So welcome to the show, Lauryn, and thank you for your time today. Maybe we can start by describing what motivated you or what inspired you to work on Afghanistan's women's rights to education and basically overall Afghan women's rights in general.
Yeah, great. Glad to be here, and thanks for the question. So I got started down this path, which I have to say is, not what I thought I would do when I was a child, and people would ask you, what will you do when you grow up? But something happened in the 1990s, which was, of course, that the Taliban took power for the first time in Afghanistan. And at that time, I was a ninth grader growing up here in Canada and had heard the news in the newspaper. I couldn't find Afghanistan on a map for the life of me. I knew virtually nothing about the country. But when I learned that girls like me couldn't go to school because they were girls and that women and girls lived under all these restrictions, and just learning about the general cruelty that was being imposed on the people, I found this completely outrageous. And I looked around me and I didn't see anyone doing anything about it. And that was equally as outrageous to see that powerful institutions like the United Nations, like my own government, seem to not really be reacting and like this was okay with everyone. And I think, in some ways, I'm grateful that this happened to me at that age. I hope it hadn't happened at all, but that I was that age, because I think young people, children, can see more clearly injustices, and they don't really buy into these excuses that we confront when we're adults, that, those people are far away from us, or those people are different from us, or they're a different religion or a different ethnicity, or, living under a different governance system. These kind of cultural relativistic kind of arguments, really don't make sense to children because they actually don't make sense at all. So I could see it for what it was, and I just couldn't live with this happening to people just like me, no matter how far away they were. And so that was the start of my activist journey. And it wasn't really planned. I just sort of went day to day. And the first thing I did was write up a petition. And then from there, I joined the human rights organization, Amnesty International. And that eventually led me to this organization, Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan. And so I was able to connect with other Canadians who were trying to do something. They were raising funds for education in Afghanistan and speaking out about what was going on and asking our government to take action in Canada. And so we joined forces, and I never looked back.
Mm-hmm. And so, you started when the first Taliban regime took over, and then now we are in the midst of the second Taliban regime. How did you feel when you saw the Taliban rolled over and started recapturing areas in Afghanistan and forcing the coalition forces to evacuate, and the Afghan government collapsed, and all of those repressive policies that you had witnessed the first time were being imposed once again? How do you feel about it?
Devastated. It was just unbelievable. And if I didn't see it actually going on and someone told me about it, it would be hard to actually believe that this was happening in, the 21st century. And after everything that had happened and sort of seeing the Taliban in action in the past and how they behaved, knowing exactly what we can expect, what they're going to do, and still sort of letting this happen. And just the fact that it could happen, it was devastating and hard to believe. But also there wasn't a lot of time to sit around and sort of think about what was going on. Just had to be in action mode. I had friends and colleagues who were being impacted by the change there and who were at risk. So I had a lot of sleepless nights as this was unfolding. And gradually it became clear that they were in power, that the fight had effectively ended, and that the world was going to accept this. And so I think we're still trying to kind of just contend with that, not accept it, but see what we can do in the context of the international community being quite complacent with what's happened. So it was a very difficult time, but on my side, I have nothing to complain about because I wasn't in Afghanistan at the time, and I didn't have to live with all of the danger and the devastation that Afghans had to live with. But at some point, I resolved that it was necessary to do two things. One was to stay, that we had to keep our programs running, that we couldn't leave the country, that we had to keep supporting people. And that would mean, shifting things and going about things differently, but that we would find a way. And the second thing was to stay hopeful and to keep some optimism. And one thing that allows me to do that is having seen this all happen before, having seen the Taliban in power and seen them go out of power and seen the great change that swept over the country. So even though, it's such a devastating situation, at the same time, I know that when it comes to Afghanistan, you just never know what's lying around the bend.
Yep, definitely. And, in the past 3.5 years, and prior to that, there was a narrative that was shaped around the Taliban 2.0, that they've reformed, that they've changed, that now they're accepting women's rights, they're accepting women to go to schools or universities or even be judges or have senior roles in the government, but none of them happened. And we saw how their regime has become much more repressive than they were in the past. And in broad daylight in front of everybody, the whole world is watching on how they're treating Afghan women, practically 20 million women being in prison, and the claim that they have changed or reformed. We don't see it. The Afghan women don't see it, and even the policies that they are implementing could be said that it's a gender apartheid or close to a genocide that is possible against Afghan women. How do you see it as a keen observer of the Afghan affairs? How do you see the Taliban regime dealing with Afghan people, particularly Afghan women and girls?
Yeah, it's virtually a replication of the first regime, which I know very well. And it's just like clockwork, all the same restrictions coming back from the ban on images of living things and a ban on music to the bans that are specific to women and girls, the education restrictions. And, as we're having this conversation, the news is pretty fresh of the ban on women's medical education or nursing schools, midwifery, these very few avenues that were left to them to still study. Those have now been closed. So all, it's like seeing the same movie all over again. And this narrative that you mentioned, it is alive and well, despite all of the things that have happened in the last 3 years. It was certainly around in August of 2021, as the Taliban were saying to the world, in front of the cameras, we're different now. We respect women. They will have rights. Everything will be peaceful. We've changed. So they said that, out one side of their mouth, and then at the very same time, within weeks, the schools were closed past from the secondary level for girls. So they're two-faced and they're deceitful, and the evidence is abundantly clear, not only from their past time in power, but this time that what they say is not what they do, and so it's all the more remarkable that there are still people out there trying to propagate this narrative in the media, commentators, observers who sit often from, comfortable locations where they don't have to live under the Taliban, saying that, everything is rosy, life is better there. And I think the first thing that you have to do is ask any women living under the Taliban right now what their life is like now. And I hear from girls and women on a daily basis telling me what they're going through. And that ranges from, just complete loss of hope in the prospect of having a future, of having a life that you can forge for yourself, to feeling suicidal, as a result of the restrictions, to just the practical concerns of daily life, like how do you go out and buy food for your family when you can't leave your home without a male chaperone or being able to speak aloud and so on, not to mention the economic devastation that's come to the country as a result of the Taliban policies. So all the evidence tells us that it's the same old Taliban, and their vision is to go back to exactly the way things were in the first time that they ruled. And they frankly just don't care what anyone says, whether it's diplomats in a Western capital or media commentators or other Muslim authorities. I mean, all kinds of representatives from the Muslim world, Islamic scholars have told them, this is not justified what you're doing. Like, look around you. You don't see any country in the world that has banned women from attending secondary education or university. And so I think what this tells us is they just don't care what anyone thinks. And this is the vision that's coming from Kandahar, and that's what they're going to implement. And they will do it at literally any cost, including, the cost in human lives.
Yeah. I think they're taking the international community for granted. I mean, the fact they don't see any authority or any concerted effort by international community to counter them, and so they are emboldened in the absence of an authority to challenge them or to deal with them seriously, that they're going about doing all of this. So hopefully that environment change at some point. And in terms of the Afghan women, they showed on the first days when the Taliban took over Kabul, they stood against the Taliban and they protested in Kabul and Herat and different provinces. They were the first groups of Afghans who rose up and indicated that more than 50% of the Afghan population disagree with this regime, that they do not like what they're doing, they do not like their policies, and they disapprove this regime. And in the absence of the political leadership in Afghanistan that could formulate a resistance or could formulate a political resistance against the Taliban, was the Afghan women who were primarily the primary opposition against the Taliban. How do you see the role of the Afghan women this time around, and how they have been courageously fighting back against the Taliban inside the country and outside the country?
Yeah, you're right about that. And literally on the first day of Taliban rule, they were in the streets protesting. And I read a lot into that because on the one hand, you could say that's so dangerous. Why would anyone risk their life for a protest? That nothing is worth dying for. But I think there's a message inherent in that. When people, they know the risks. Of course, they're not ignorant of the risks. So when they're choosing to protest in such a visible, vocal way, knowing the risks, the message is that they feel they have everything to lose, that, everything is at stake there, and that life is simply not worth living under this kind of regime where you don't have rights. It's a false peace. I mean, peace is not just the absence of guns and fighting. Peace has to do with the freedoms that you have to live a life worth living. And they've continued those protests. The coverage of them certainly died down. The focus is often on, what the Taliban are doing and on women as victims, but they have continued to protest and really paid the price, because now we're hearing the reports of women who have been detained, who have been tortured, whose lives have really been devastated on account of participating in protests, whether in person or online. And yet that's continued. So that's a really key message to the world. And then, both women in Afghanistan and women who have been exiled have continued the fight in all kinds of ways, from trying to pursue mechanisms through the international justice system. And there's been some, I think, promising first moves there. Definitely not a solution, but some momentum growing that can be built on, to advocating and raising awareness, to fundraising and trying to support programming that's still going on in the country, to speaking out in international forums like at the recent UN General Assembly, and coming up in a couple of months, the Commission on the Status of Women in New York. And so these various international forums trying to consistently get that message out that we will not be abandoned. We want our voices heard. And they're saying quite loudly and clearly that they want rights and they feel entitled to rights. And so when occasionally here in the West, I confront non-Afghans who try to spin this yarn of cultural relativism and saying, human rights are a Western ideal and that's not compatible with Afghan culture, or that's something that we in the West are trying to impose, and that's not really what people want. I mean, this isn't coming from me, the notion that they want rights. It's coming directly from the voices of Afghan women. They understand human rights very well, and there's this real inherent demand for them, a homegrown, local grassroots movement that is becoming stronger. And I think that's something a bit different from the previous period of Taliban rule. I think women learn things from that time. And now they're also supported by the presence of technological tools that they can use to get their message out more.
Absolutely. And some of those arguments, I have also heard that some people, they portray themselves as if they're understanding of the culture, or they are trying to respect the other culture. And I think they don't understand that within that argument, or within that show, is basically an inherent bias, that they feel that the other people in that part of the world are not as deserving as the Western countries to enjoy the liberties and rights that the Western civilization or Western countries have. I mean, I don't think people are noticing that there is a bias, a judgment. They're indicating that as if they're understanding of their culture, but at the back of their head, it is that those people are less of a human being than we are. So maybe they should live in whatever conditions. Anyways,
that's the irony of it. I mean, it comes from a surprising place. It comes from people who think of themselves as really progressive and open-minded. I'm not hearing this from right-wing pundits. I'm hearing it from people on the so-called left who think that they're kind of defending Afghans, and actually they're infantilizing them, because they're effectively saying, you're not ready for the things that we feel entitled to, like democracy and rights and freedoms. And that's simply the racism of low expectations. And I totally reject this. And I think we have to confront that thinking when we come across it, and really challenge it, and ask people to do a better job of putting themselves in the shoes of Afghans, and thinking, what would it be like to be living this life? And I mean, that's really easy for me to do, because I've been there and I've spent time with Afghans, and I saw they're just like us, that they're trying to live their life, and they have all the same, hopes and dreams and worries and anxieties that we do. And so, but then here I see that differentiation, that wanting to kind of put Afghans in another category, which has the convenience of excusing our action, because as the minute we do that, we can say, well, we're not obliged to say anything about this or do anything about this, because those people are different from us. And we live in this age of identity politics and a politics of difference. And I think changing that is part of addressing what's actually going on in Afghanistan and stopping those injustices.
Absolutely. And given the situation in Afghanistan, that democracy that we had, or the liberties that the people enjoyed, it was basically as a result of the efforts from the Western countries, from NATO countries and others. And the regional countries are all autocrats, all dictatorships, all religious theocracy. At one hand, there's a communist dictatorship, and there's a military dictatorship. And so they didn't like what we had. And so they all worked together to make sure this fails. And it's failed. They forced the international community to leave Afghanistan, and they forced the collapse of our regime, or our system of governance, and the rights and liberties. So Afghans and women's rights activists and human rights activists do not have a place in the region. There's no supporter. They're all in bed with the Taliban, because that's their primary proxy, and all of the terrorist organizations that are going to serve them. But the Western countries, there is a sense of a dual feeling of the Afghans towards them. At one hand, they feel a sense of betrayal of how they managed this process that led to the collapse, that maybe they could have done a better job of securing all of the achievements that we had while withdrawing, while leaving their troops if they wanted to. But at the same time, there is a sense of appreciation, because these were the capitals, these are the places where organizations and entities and even government officials at senior level, up to presidents and prime ministers, have been vocal and active on various fronts with respect to women's rights and human rights in Afghanistan. And they have been also policy-wise. We see recently countries like Canada, Germany, Australia, and others who are joining hands and forces to take the Taliban to court, and hopefully they will be sentenced and tried. And so how do you see the role of the international community in support of the Afghan women in the past 3.5 years? Are we moving towards a direction where we will see more and more of the support from the international community for Afghans who want democracy and liberty and freedoms against the Taliban and seek the collapse of the Taliban?
Yeah, I think things are just starting to improve, literally in the past like 3 months from now. And the first shift was with this announcement of the adjudication of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. So basically taking a country to court, the Taliban-run Afghanistan, to the International Court of Justice, the so-called Court of Nations. So that was Canada and 3 other countries that initiated that process. And you know, it's a slow process, and in many ways it's more symbolic than having real impacts. But the symbolism does hold a lot of value, and in sort of being the first time that the international justice system was used to say, hey, you've violated a law that we countries have agreed to, and there's consensus around, and we're going to take action in that regard. And then more recently was the news that there's been some movement around the International Criminal Court investigation, which has been ongoing for some time, but I think is picking up speed. And there's been a lot of calls from Afghan women activists and other advocates saying this investigation must include gender apartheid. It must look at the gender-based violations happening, and the ICC is different from the ICJ in that people can actually go to prison. So individuals can be tried in the International Criminal Court. And I think, you know, will senior Taliban members actually, you know, go to prison and be sentenced? Will they participate in the trial? Probably not. But one of the powerful impacts is that this can deter countries that are currently doing business with the Taliban, which is really helping them and supporting them and sort of leading to this normalization of the regime. And you mentioned the, you know, tough neighborhood that Afghanistan finds itself in. But, you know, even beyond that immediate neighborhood, all kinds of other states have been really warming up to the Taliban. You have Russia and China doing a lot of trade and political engagement, Kazakhstan, and then recently the closure of several Afghan embassies that were under the control of the previous regime, as well as, you know, various diplomats going back and forth between Taliban, Afghanistan, and other countries. And every time something like that happens, it makes it easier for the next state that wants to do the same. And I think the ICC case, as well as the CEDA adjudication, you know, sends a warning, like you're doing business with some real bad guys, and you might want to think twice about that. And there are actually, you know, repercussions for supporting regimes that have these cases underway. So I think that's hopeful. And you know, you're right that Afghanistan was this bastion of the free press and human rights and democratic development compared to its surroundings. And I remember years ago sitting in a hotel room in Herat, and I was really close to the Iranian border, and I was searching something online, and the website was blocked because we were so close to the border that the Iranian, you know, internet censors were hitting us. And it was so jarring because it just wasn't something that you were accustomed to in Afghanistan. And, you know, in Afghanistan, you could get access to this really rich variety of media, you know, hundreds of radio stations and newspapers, and everybody knows the success of the television industry. And there was this real, you know, information being exchanged that was, you know, lots of problems in the governance of the country, but these things were solidifying the political development of the country, and that was in stark contrast to the rest of the neighborhood. So I can see that, you know, there's states that did not want Afghanistan to succeed, and I think that would have to be addressed as part of a strategy going forward. And the last point to mention on this is that, you know, states like Canada, the United States, it's very challenging for them to engage with the Taliban, but they do have channels to engage with these countries that are supporting the Taliban. You know, they have embassies in Kazakhstan and Turkey and China, and I think much more needs to be done in addressing the normalization of the Taliban and the support that they're getting from other states. By Western states need to address that.
Yeah, yeah. When sometimes I think about the international community and how they have been failed in a lot of areas. Of course, they haven't been able to prevent conflicts. They haven't been able to prevent terrorists taking over a government. But I was hoping that maybe at some point, if this court thing works out, that all of the countries and nations come on board, especially the liberal Western democracies, and together in a concerted effort could arrest the Taliban leaders and put them in a trial where a woman judge could issue a verdict on them on how, all of the atrocities that they have committed against the Afghan women and Afghan population, and basically against the people of the world, because these Afghan women are basically women of the world, and the people of the world. We're all human beings. We are connected, and so that could be a major breakthrough, a success story for humanity. That
Yeah.
at least we could take action on one of these terrorist groups. Anyways, hopefully that will come to reality, and we'll see it. Maybe talk about your organization and your efforts, and how. What's your vision? What's your mission? And what are some of the programs, and what of some of the advocacy work that you're doing in terms of helping the Afghan women and girls, but also I'm sure your efforts on mobilizing the international community to support the Afghan women and girls.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've long focused on education. I mean, far before the regime change in the country, education was the focus of our programming. And it's become even more important now because some of the things that we did before, they were like complementary to in-person education. So we've worked in technology for education for 15 years or so now. And it was a way to enhance classroom education. And in 2021, it became the main vehicle of education when classrooms closed down. And of course, that's not the situation we want, but this is what we have available. So we said, let's see what we can do with this. So virtual and distance education is a big part of our programming. Being able to offer accredited secondary schooling opportunities to Afghan nationals. And also supporting women who perhaps are high school graduates looking for a higher level of education to be able to access free courses online that help them get into university programs or learn skills that could improve employability and just more opportunities for them. We offer free English courses and a wide range of courses. We have a large collection of online learning materials. We call it the Directe Danesh Library. So that's around 8,000 learning materials that we've developed over the years that are available in the main languages of Dari and Pashto, but also several minority languages like Uzbeki, so people can easily access them. We have a scholarship program to help women pay for costs associated with education. So that's open to people who are enrolled in some kind of education program, whether that's in person or online in Afghanistan, outside of Afghanistan. They can come and say, I need help with my tuition payments or my plane ticket or my special equipment, textbooks, whatever it may be. And then we have another fund which is specifically to support the costs of technology. So paying for devices or internet packages that help people get online and study from home. We work in resettlement in Canada, so we support at-risk Afghans who are trying to get to safety. And like you mentioned, we do a lot of advocacy and public engagement. So that work is about trying to keep the Canadian public informed what's going on in the country. Make sure they understand the situation, that they have tools and messages that they can get out in their own communities, and then advocating with policymakers, with different stakeholder groups for the change that we want to see happen. And we are pretty focused at this time on these international justice mechanisms that we mentioned earlier. And another one we didn't mention is the recent forward movement on a convention on crimes against humanity. And this convention, which is it's drafted but not applied yet, but it's coming. This is a really key opportunity to make gender apartheid explicitly a crime against humanity, which brings with it all kinds of possibilities for prosecution and for justice and accountability. So Afghan advocates and legal scholars have been really crucial to asking for just simply one line of text to be added to that convention that says gender apartheid is a crime against humanity. So that's something promising as well that we've been calling for. But there's lots else to do at the same time because these things move very, very slowly. But you mentioned a minute ago about, that the what's happening is really about humanity, and these processes, the Convention on the Crimes Against Humanity, the International Court of Justice process. If we can make clear that gender apartheid is a crime and that there's consequences for committing that crime, this doesn't only benefit Afghanistan, it benefits, the globe in general, because that's the way international law works. It applies internationally. And so Afghanistan is kind of the trigger that's strengthening how the justice system works for the rights of women. But those things will then be in place in the future, just in the same way as, apartheid came to be defined because of what was going on in South Africa. And today, racial apartheid is considered a crime against humanity globally. And you aren't seeing, states try to impose racial apartheid anymore because there were consequences, and that all came about because of what happened in South Africa and the international response to it. So we're hoping for a kind of parallel experience to that in the case of gender apartheid in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be that hard, right? The gender apartheid is a crime against humanity. It shouldn't be that hard to include that there. What do you see? How do you see the possibility of the Taliban's regime being considered as a gender apartheid regime?
Yeah, I think it's a clear-cut case, and of course that's obvious to someone like me with the bias that I bring to the situation, but the evidence is accumulating, and in court processes of any kind, including international court processes, evidence is really, really crucial. And fortunately, there's a pretty concerted, organized effort to collect evidence. Organizations like Afghan Witness and others are doing a great job documenting what's going on. And witnesses will be called forth to share testimony. So I think there's indisputable evidence of the Taliban's gender apartheid crimes, and the next part is to make sure that they pay for those crimes.
Yeah, and it's even worse than the apartheid because they're even close to genocide. With the medical doctors and professionals being out, women not being able to get out, not being able to speak, not being able to do any life whatsoever, basically confined in their houses and homes. And if they get sick, there are no female doctors to treat them, and they don't like women to be treated by male doctors. So basically, women who are sick and they get diseases or they get birth or whatever situations, they don't care if they die. That's how they're treating the Afghan women right now. Is they're basically imprisoned everybody, and then if they die, I mean they would let them die. I mean that is their perspective. Yeah. That's their mentality against the women in general, and you see that being replicated also in terms of their approaches on how they're dealing with their own lives, of how they're forcefully marrying women. The teenagers, underage girls, and they call it marriage. It's not marriage, it's rape. They forcefully take somebody and then they take first, second, and third wives. So when I look at this, I feel like the women have been facing discrimination and injustice for millennium, centuries, and they have been trying to push back. They've been trying to move towards equality and justice. But those forces who want to keep the women, bogged down, they're always active, and they use violence, they use force, and they use manipulation, all sorts of tactics to prevent women from progress. And Afghanistan is basically, I think, that center stage that we're looking at how those forces, anti-women forces, join hands together inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan to keep the Afghan women confined and in chains, and basically showcasing how, if they get the power and if they get their hands on, what they would do to the women around the world. So hopefully our efforts in pushing back and freeing Afghan women, that is going to happen, I'm sure, hopefully sooner than later, will be a blow to these fanatics to these extremists, to these terrorists, and these anti-women elements inside Afghanistan, outside Afghanistan, that they have no place to do this, and we will hunt them down. And hopefully, with the justice system being in place, that we could easily identify and detect each of them wherever they are and put them behind bars where they belong, right?
Exactly. I mean, the international community has to say that loud and clear, that this is not civilization. This is not what we do. I mean, not even in the 21st century, just at all, that we don't treat human beings like this. And I think, for all the time that I've done this work from the 1990s up till now, this question has hung over my head of, why doesn't this outrage us? Why? And you're right that it is this kind of gender side. Women are dying. And sometimes I think there's this impression that it's just about strict dress codes and these minor inconveniences. No, they're literally murdering women. They're murdering them in direct ways, like killing activists. And that's well documented by Afghan Witness and others, that hundreds of women dissidents, protesters, women affiliated with the previous government, and journalists and others have been killed. Others have been disappeared. Others killed themselves when they came out of prison and couldn't live with the shame of the sexual and violence that they'd endured. And the floggings, this really physical harm and life and death matters. And somehow it's just not outrageous. And earlier this year, when the story came out in the Guardian, it had already been out in the Afghan press, but it was the first time it was reaching the international press. The story of the systemic sexual violence taking place in Afghan prisons. They documented the story of one particular woman, but it was clear that this is happening systemically. It's not isolated at all. And I kind of sat back and waited, for the response, where's the outrage, the fury? Are we really going to read about this and say this is okay? And there was just deafening silence. I mean, it was like a non-issue, a non-story, and how we can accept that is just, I don't have an answer for why this doesn't outrage us, other than my suspicion that it is about the politics of difference. It is about saying, yes, we don't like those things. We wouldn't want them to happen to people in our society, but that society is different. So I think we have to sort of pull that thread and make that narrative unravel so that we can see clearly the cruelties going on and send a clear message that this is intolerable. And I think it just proves, that for the supreme leader, there's no price too heavy to pay. That death, rape, the devastation of the economy, poverty, all the impact that this is going to have on children, because we know that when women lack education, there's higher infant and child mortality rates, higher rates of childhood disease, of child labor, and so on and so forth. It's just this domino effect of bad things that happen to everybody in the population, male, female, children, men, women, when women are treated poorly. So ultimately, everyone will pay the price. And I think for the Taliban leadership, that's fine with them.
Yeah, and it's not going to confine in Afghanistan. If it carries on, I'm sure it will not. It emboldens all of the extremist elements and anti-women elements in all of the societies. I'm sure those are present everywhere. The terrorist organizations, the extremist ones, to feel like they could replicate. They could do the same way, and they could push women out of the workforce, push women out of politics, push women out of the leadership positions, and or treat women in however way that they want, and then get away with it. I think having this group in charge is going to be having negative consequences all around. And so hopefully sooner than later we join hands together and we get rid of this group and put them behind bars where they belong. And so what do you think? You said that the previous time they went away. This time also you're confident they're going to go away. How soon do you think that's going to happen? And what do you see the future of Afghanistan in coming years and decades?
I mean, I hope it happens tomorrow, but I think we should prepare, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. It's very possible that we could be in the situation for years. I feel, though, that it is so unsustainable that it's hard to imagine it being really long term. The country is, leaking people everyone who can leave is leaving. Human capital is just being decimated, and so that will mean infrastructure is decimated, and it becomes really hard. It already has become hard for government ministries to function because the people with the technical skills to do that work have left or are planning to leave. So this is going to continue. Afghanistan will become more and more isolated. So something's got to give at some point. I think everyone's familiar too with the fact that there's significant internal division within the Taliban movement. So that's hard to predict what direction that's going to go in. And then sometimes things just happen. External events shape what's going to happen. So I think we should sort of, be prepared for this to last for a while, but also at the same time be thinking about what if things change suddenly. We want the types of programs we're running in our case for our organization to still be helpful and still be relevant. And so for us, things like accreditation are super, super important. There's learning for the sake of learning, but we want to make sure that the education that we're able to provide is going to be useful in any scenario. So if a young woman stays in Afghanistan now or in the future, or if she leaves and she's living in the region, or she goes further afield, that she will be able to use that education to pursue her goals. Something quite exciting in the work that we're doing as part of our sort of community of organizations in the sector is really thinking about education in a systems way, because in many ways, all of these independent organizations are doing the job of government. Normally, governments are responsible for delivering secondary education and regulating higher education. And because they're not doing that, these organizations have stepped into the void, and that's really important and necessary. But there's cons to that as well, in that you don't have consistent quality, there's no compliance, there's no regulatory body telling you to do this or not do that, oversight over things like teacher credentials and curriculum. So I think the community of organizations that are delivering education programming for women and girls need to get organized to hold themselves to a standard of quality. And that is happening now, and we're part of those efforts. And I think that if we do that well, that will serve, the future situation in Afghanistan. I think of it as kind of like holding the education system, trying to preserve it and build it and grow it and take care of it for the future. Because I personally saw the situation for education, in like late 2002. Right after the end of the Taliban regime, when schools for girls reopened, and you had an education system that was almost, rebuilding almost from nothing, and the needs were so great, and it took many years before anyone could even think about quality because they were so busy with just like building schools and trying to get teachers and backpacks and desks and all these basics. So if we can kind of preserve an education system, make it as strong and good as it can possibly be, that is something that will serve prosperity and peace and development in Afghanistan in the future. And I think we should never underestimate what educated people or people who can access education in crisis situations can do down the road. So the more people we reach and we make sure that they get an education, whether they're in Afghanistan or they're displaced in the region or elsewhere, that they're still able to learn despite their circumstances, those are going to be the people that rebuild the country later and run it later. And we shouldn't think of it as a charitable act to support them, but as a necessity, and that they're assets and we're going to need them later. So we need to invest in them now.
Yeah, and I'm very hopeful that the things will change for the better at the international community, particularly in the Western countries, because I think it's one thing to talk about the rights and values and our shared humanity, but I think one thing that caught the attention of the Western countries previously was terrorism, and how the Taliban being in charge and how all of the terrorist groups there are working together to attack the Western countries. That is something that everybody pays attention to, and I think there is a realization now that if the Taliban are the same on every other front, that they are the same Taliban and worse, that they're probably also on the same Taliban on terrorism, that they have ties with Al Qaeda, they have ties with all of the terrorist groups around the world, and now it's much more dangerous because now all of them together are being sponsored, and they are working together with the Chinese Communist Party, with Putin's circle, and with the IRGC of Iran, and some circles with ISI, which is very the axis of evil, as some people call it in the States. That they're working together in conjunction, and all of this attacks, ISIS, or these individual attacks. We hear some Afghan did something here and there. All of them are connected, and all of them go back to the Taliban coming back to power, and that's where they originating. And so hopefully that threat that is getting closer to the homeland is going to keep make people to shift their policies, and stop all of those engagements or being complacent, and start being more active on the front of helping the Afghan people to topple this terrorist state, this gender apartheid regime in Afghanistan. So hopefully we will see a change at the international level. Well, what do you think? You think that is it? Do you feel the same way?
Definitely. And I'm extremely concerned about the radicalization of people through education, which the Taliban are very intentionally pursuing right now. They recognize that public education systems are powerful vehicles to disseminate ideology, and that can be good ideology or bad ideology. So they're already converting public schools into madrasas at scale, and they're teaching really scary stuff. And I think that the West should be very, very worried about this. Like, if they thought the Taliban of 2000, 2001 were bad, like, wait till you see what's coming when they are able to indoctrinate millions of people this way. They've revised the textbooks. There's all kinds of evidence of the changes being made in education. And I've been trying to raise the alarm on this. And I'm hopeful that when it comes from a security argument, that they may come around to recognizing the danger. You can kind of be standing in the corner yelling like human rights, and you only get so much attention for it. But I think there's really fundamentally a security issue that they should be paying attention to, and it seems hard for the international community to think long term, because this is something that we'll see the consequences of it a few years down the road, perhaps not tomorrow, but it will be ugly. It will be very ugly.
Yeah. And, you said how you started your advocacy and how impactful work you're doing. Afghans know you in all walks of life, and they appreciate the work that you're doing. And I'm sure Canadians are happy to have you representing them as a brand ambassador of someone who stands on righteousness, stands on liberty, education, and peace, and prosperity for human beings. And your focus on Afghanistan, it's a place where is really needed the attention. So what advice do you have for young people watching this program in Canada, in the United States, or other countries, and that are interested to do advocacy on social issues and social justice or gender rights and human rights? What advice do you have for them?
I guess firstly, I'd say, shed this identity politics of difference, like, be pro-human. Every person you meet in any circumstance, see them firstly as a human, before you see them as a Muslim, Afghan, fill in the blank, man, women, etc. That we're humans. We have more in common than we have apart, and let that principle guide everything you do. And I have this sort of habit of just asking, like, well, what would I do in that situation? And that's my compass. That's how I know what's right and wrong. So if you wouldn't want to be told that you can't go to school, or your daughter could never grow up to pursue the career she wants or vote, then you shouldn't accept that for anyone else, no matter where they are in the world. That's one thing. The second is to develop your competency. It's one thing to have opinions and speak out, but to be useful, having some kind of technical skill that you can contribute to justice, to human rights, to change, is useful. I think competency is actually is power, is the greatest power there is. And thirdly, to be courageous in speaking up, and that's so hard to do. I mean, I say it now, but it's hard for me too. If you're, in a circle of friends or, in a group of people, and they say something that has some, kind of a questionable morality behind it, like what we talked about earlier, the racism of low expectations, to not sort of sit back and be quiet, but to say something. And I think we've largely lost the ability to do that. Like, we're living in such polarized times that we just kind of avoid disagreements. If someone has a different opinion, we just get out of the room and, stop communicating with them. And I think we have to relearn the skill of like civil disagreement and not be uncomfortable with criticism and with conversation that where we can disagree with each other. And challenge some of the bad ideas out there, I think, in our culture. And then you have to be hopeful and optimistic. You can't let cynicism get the best of you. That's not something I have to try out a lot these days, because of the programs we're running, we get to interact with women and girls who things are getting better for them, or they're accessing education, and they tell us the difference that's making for them. And so that gives us like a little shot of hope all the time that lets us keep going. And I honestly just don't know what I'd do if I did any other job than this, because I would feel so helpless kind of being on the outside looking in. So it's a very, very bad situation, but the only place I'd want to be is doing something about that and addressing it. And I guess a last point is to, related to this, the first point I made is to see things less as being about Afghanistan or a specific country or region, and more on the theme. And we often complain about other international conflicts are kind of pushing Afghanistan out of the spotlight, and people are distracted with what's going on in Ukraine or other conflicts. And I actually see these conflicts as all related. I mean, I see the fight of Ukrainians as one against fascism, and the fight of Afghans is one against fascism. And so I think we have to talk more about principles and ideas than about specific people or places. And we shouldn't be embarrassed to say, we want to fight for freedom and for rights. I think these ideas of the Enlightenment, they're kind of like they've kind of fallen out of fashion with a lot of young people today, and I think we have to bring them back. And part of the reason they've fallen out of fashion is we haven't had to fight for them. I mean, here in Canada, it's so long ago that women had to fight for the right to vote and the right to choose their path in life. That we've started to take these rights for granted, and to see the struggles that people elsewhere are going through. We have to understand the value those things hold, and the risks people are taking to fight for them, and show our solidarity with them. And if you can do those things, let me tell you, the reward is great. I mean, I don't see it in any way the work I do as a sacrifice. I feel like the luckiest person in the world. Every day I feel fulfilled and rewarded doing this work. And it's never boring. It's many things, but it's never ever dull. It's interesting and engaging, and so there's great reward in being able to be an activist.
Yeah, and we're pleased to have you to focus on Afghanistan issues. And a great conversation. We learned a lot. I have a lot of questions, but I don't think we have the time. Maybe next time we'll definitely come back to you and talk about the specifics about some of the initiatives, and when we could closer and some of the success stories. Hopefully, we'll have on the international level to deal with the Taliban. Then again, we can speak. But before we end the conversation, what's your message to the Afghan people, and particularly Afghan women and girls, those who are watching inside the country and those who are scattered around the region helplessly, and those who are living in Western countries and trying to find a way to go back?
Yeah, I have this letter from a 15-year-old girl printed out and hanging on my office wall, and I read it every day. And one of the things she writes in this letter is, "We want the world to see us, hear us, feel us. Don't forget about us." So my message is that I see you. I see you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Lauren, for your time. Executive Director of the Right to Learn Afghanistan. We appreciate your time and efforts. Hopefully, we'll talk again. To all of those who are watching, this was our episode on Real Talks with Amini. Until the next show and next conversation, God bless you. God bless Afghanistan, and God bless our world. Thank you.